30 years. That woman had 30 years with my brother, and she used every single one of them like a slow draining battery pack. She pulled just enough out of him each day that he never noticed how empty he was getting. My name is Michael. I am a 58-year-old retired Army CID investigator. I have spent the better part of my adult life watching human beings in controlled environments. I know what a caged person looks like. I recognize that cage in my twin, Christopher. Then came the 2 a.m. call from Georgetown. He was shaking. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from. Have you ever seen a loved one lose their spark to a controlling partner? I didn't offer sympathy. I didn't offer a shoulder to cry on. Sympathy is a luxury my brother couldn't afford at 2:15 in the morning, and I had spent 30 years watching him pay for luxuries he never received. I told him one thing: drive to the inn near the river and wait. I'm coming to get you. This wasn't a family visit. It was an extraction. I got out of bed and looked at my wife, Amanda. She has the kind of intuition that comes from 32 years of marriage to a man who lived in the world of high stakes investigations. She didn't ask if I was sure. She just asked how long. I told her 10 days, maybe more. Amanda reached for her phone to clear my schedule. She told me to practice his handwriting, especially the way he loops his lowercase letters. I told her we were identical, but she gave me that look. The look that said Jennifer would be searching for any crack in the armor. I was on the road to Northern Virginia. Before the sun even thought about rising, my mind was already running the Richmond Protocol, methodical, cold, clinical. Christopher is a genius restoration architect, a man who can look at a crumbling 18th century facade and see the soul of the building. But Jennifer had spent 3 decades turning that brilliant mind into a cluttered room of self-doubt. When I pulled into that Georgetown parking lot 2 hours later, I saw exactly what 30 years of psychological siege looks like. My brother was sitting in his sensible sedan, staring at nothing. He looked like a man who had survived a crash but was still waiting for the impact. Jennifer had denied him a weekend retreat to a historical symposium, a simple 3-day trip to talk about old stone and mortar with people who actually respected him. She claimed his mental fog was getting worse. She told him he was becoming unreliable and that he needed to stay home to finish her event spreadsheets. It was the same script she'd been running for years. Isolate him, convince him he's broken, and then offer to manage his life as an act of mercy. I walked up to his window and tapped. He flinched. That was the first thing I had to fix. Christopher doesn't flinch. I told him to get out of the car. I handed him the keys to my truck and a map to our house in Richmond. Amanda is waiting, I said. You're going to eat real food, sleep in a room without a shadow, and you are going to stay off the grid. No phones, no emails, no Jennifer. He looked at me with his own face, my face, and I saw the terror of a man leaving a prison he'd grown to call home. I'm not going back, he whispered. I looked him dead in the eye. No, you aren't. But I am. Before he left, I had him sign a limited power of attorney, naming me his legal proxy, a necessary shield for the tactical audit I was about to perform. I watched him drive south toward Richmond, toward the safe house. Then I turned toward the Georgetown estate. I sat in his car for 5 minutes, adjusting the seat, the mirrors, and the radio. I cleared my mind of Michael and began the restoration of Christopher. It was time to show Jennifer what happens when the architecture of a person's life is reclaimed by a professional. The house in Georgetown didn't feel like a home. It felt like a high-end gallery where the main exhibit was my brother's slow disappearance. Jennifer was in the study when I arrived, already operating in what I'd come to think of as the management posture, chin up, shoulders set, eyes fixed on an iPad, as if the world were a spreadsheet that only she could balance. She didn't look up as I walked in. I've spent 25 years watching people in institutions, and I know the type. People who control others don't bother with eye contact, because eye contact implies negotiation. Instructions don't negotiate. I stood there wearing my brother's face, watching her navigate his life from a screen. I had spent my career in Army CID investigating cold-blooded manipulation, but this was a different level of tactical siege. Later, I found the bank records. She had been siphoning $5,500 every single month from his restoration firm, labeling it a consulting fee for her luxury event business. It was a professional parasite move, draining his resources while convincing him he was lucky she was there to help him manage his legacy. People will eventually ask why a brilliant man like Christopher stayed in a house that was slowly killing his spirit for 30 years. They call it weakness, but they don't understand the anatomy of an invisible cage. This wasn't a prison built with bars. It was built with 1,000 small no's and 3 decades of being told his own desires were a betrayal of the family. It is what we call learned helplessness. When every exit is blocked by a lecture and every independent thought is framed as a symptom of failure, survival begins to look like total compliance. He wasn't weak. He was a survivor who had learned to hide so deep inside himself that Jennifer forgot he was still in there. Then I found the dossier in the bottom drawer of her mahogany desk, the dementia folder. It wasn't a medical file. It was a weaponized log. Every time Christopher had forgotten where he put his keys, every time he was too exhausted to answer a question, she had documented it with surgical precision. She was fabricating a narrative of early onset dementia to justify a legal conservatorship. She wasn't just managing his life, she was preparing to legally erase his autonomy so she could seize total control of his architecture firm and the Westcott estate. I looked at the evidence she had gathered, half-truths twisted into clinical observations, and I felt a cold clarity that the Army never could have taught me. Jennifer thought she was 30 days away from a total takeover. She thought she was closing the lid on a 30-year project. She didn't realize that for the first time in 3 decades, the man standing behind her wasn't just listening to instructions, he was gathering his own evidence for a final, lethal audit. Jennifer noticed the shift almost immediately. I was making too much eye contact, and my voice lacked the familiar tremor of a man who had been told he was failing for 30 years. I coughed slightly, blaming a sudden bout of spring allergies for the rasp in my throat, a tactical mask to hide the differences in our inflection. I had to be careful. I was holding my coffee mug by the handle. Christopher always held it with both hands, seeking warmth from the ceramic as if it were the only comfort in the house. I made the adjustment, but the friction was already there. Jennifer wasn't used to friction. She was used to a husband who functioned like a well-oiled gear in her machine, silent and predictable. She began her escalation on Tuesday evening. I heard her in the hallway, her voice a practiced whisper of tragedy. She was on the phone with William and Olivia, our children, or rather Christopher's children. She was telling them that Dad is having another episode. She spoke about his mental decline with the clinical detachment of a doctor, but the intent was pure malice. She had been carefully intercepting their calls and sending erratic, nonsensical texts from his phone to convince them he had become paranoid and unstable. She was painting a picture of a man who couldn't remember his own address, ensuring that when she finally moved to take legal control, her children would be too grieved to question her. It was a professional-grade gaslighting campaign designed to isolate him from his own blood so she could become the sole arbiter of his estate. Then came the evening tea at 9 o'clock. It was a ritual, a moment of connection that Christopher had described as the most exhausting part of his day. I watched her through the reflection in the polished surface of the microwave. She was poised, her back to me, but her movements were too deliberate, too focused. She pulled a small vial from the pocket of her silk robe and added 3 drops of a clear liquid into the ivory cup meant for me. This was the source of the mental fog she had been documenting in her dementia folder with such surgical precision. It wasn't early onset dementia. It was a slow motion chemical hit. She wasn't just managing his life. She was chemically inducing the symptoms of his failure. I didn't feel anger yet. Anger is an emotional response, and this required a tactical one. I waited until she turned toward the refrigerator to grab the lemon, and I swapped the mugs in 2 seconds. My hands were steady. I have spent my adult life watching people in controlled environments, and I knew exactly how to move without leaving a trace. When she handed me the cup, she smiled, the kind of smile you give a dog you are about to put down as an act of mercy. I watched her take a long, satisfied sip of her own tea. Within 45 minutes, the management posture began to dissolve. Her speech slowed, the words slurring slightly as the sedative took hold. She tripped over the edge of the rug in the den, her chin dropping as her focus fractured. I didn't help her up. I didn't offer a steadying hand. I sat in my brother's chair, opened the voice recording app on my phone, and set it on the side table. She started rambling a disjointed confession fueled by the very drug she had intended for my brother. She talked about the Heritage Fund and how she earned every cent of the Westcott estate for putting up with Christopher's drifting for 30 years. I didn't argue. I didn't even speak. I just watched, cold and clinical, as the woman who had spent 3 decades dismantling my brother's soul finally began to dismantle her own facade. I spent 25 years in the CID, tracking shadows and balancing sheets that didn't want to be balanced. Family drama is often just a chaotic mess of feelings, but fraud? Fraud is a map. It has a beginning, a middle, and a very specific end. Jennifer had been using my brother's bank account like a personal vault, convinced that Christopher was too unreliable to ever audit his own life. I spent Wednesday night in the quiet of his architectural firm's office. I wasn't there to restore a building. I was there to restore the truth. I contacted an old ally from my Army days, a man who now works as a high-level financial auditor. We didn't look at the surface. We went deep into the Heritage Preservation Fund. It was supposed to be my brother's legacy, a fund dedicated to the architectural integrity of Georgetown. Instead, it was Jennifer's private exit strategy. We found nearly $200,000 that had been systematically siphoned away over the last 3 years. It wasn't just a misallocation of funds. It was a tactical withdrawal into an offshore account registered in her maiden name. Nearly $200,000 of my brother's hard work and genius moved while she sat across from him at dinner, telling him he was too confused to handle the spreadsheets. Thursday morning, I stepped into one of Christopher's bespoke suits. It fit perfectly, but I wore it with a posture he hadn't dared to use in decades. I walked into the executive boardroom of Westcott Restoration with a CID officer's precision. Jennifer was already there, holding court at the head of the table. She looked at me with that patronizing smile, that management posture that assumed I was only there to observe. She began to speak, likely ready to explain why the board should start looking to her for final decisions, citing my mental decline. I didn't let her finish. I sat at the head of the table, displaced her iPad with a thick physical folder, and looked at the board members. These were people who had respected Christopher for years, but had recently been conditioned to view him with pity. I ended that pity in 10 seconds. I opened the folder. It didn't contain blueprints. It contained the definitive paper trail of the entire $200,000. I have spent the last 48 hours conducting an internal audit of our consulting agreements, I said. My voice was calm, factual, and lethal. And I have found gross financial irregularities that make our current arrangement impossible to continue. Under the material breach and moral turpitude clauses of our bylaws, I am exercising my executive right to suspend all subsidiary contracts pending a forensic audit. I handed the evidence to the board. Jennifer tried to speak, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to claim I was having another episode, but I didn't flinch. I didn't get angry. Anger is a waste of resources. I simply informed the board that, effective immediately, we were terminating the firm's contract with Jennifer's event business. I looked her dead in the eye, waiting for her to find a response that didn't exist. Your consulting services are no longer required, I said, and the Heritage Fund is being frozen pending a full criminal investigation. I watched the machine of her 30-year control stall and fail in front of witnesses. She wasn't the manager anymore. She was a liability. This wasn't a family dispute. It was accounting. And the balance sheet was finally moving back into my brother's favor. I took the small glass vial to a private lab in Virginia. I didn't go through official channels. I went to a man I'd worked with during my CID days, a toxicologist who had spent 30 years looking at things that shouldn't be in the human bloodstream. He didn't ask questions. He just took the sample and told me to come back in 4 hours. He ran a preliminary rapid screening, a high-speed panel designed for emergency medical verification to confirm the presence of synthetic compounds before the formal lab report was finalized. I spent those 4 hours sitting in a coffee shop, watching the rain hit the window and thinking about the slow draining battery metaphor. I had thought Jennifer was just an emotional vampire. I had thought she was just an expert in the architecture of misery. I was wrong. It was much more calculated than that. When I went back to the lab, my contact didn't look me in the eye. He just slid a report across the counter. It was a potent sedative, a synthetic compound, usually reserved for patients in extreme psychiatric distress. It wasn't designed for daily consumption. In high doses, it stops the heart. In low, steady doses, the kind Jennifer was adding to the ivory teacup every night, it induces a state of chronic cognitive impairment. It causes memory loss, disorientation, and a terrifying sense of confusion. It doesn't just make you look like you have dementia. It mimics the biological markers. This was the criminal twist. This wasn't a marriage dispute. This was a long-term medical kidnapping conducted in plain sight. Jennifer wasn't just waiting for my brother to fade away. She was actively erasing him. She was the one providing the symptoms that she was then documenting in her dementia folder. It was a closed loop of absolute cruelty, but I needed the final link. I needed to know how she planned to get a clinical diagnosis past a board-certified neurologist. I went back to the Georgetown estate while Jennifer was out at a lunch meeting. I opened her encrypted laptop. My CID training hadn't faded as much as I thought. I found the emails. Dr. Hilliard, he was a prestigious specialist in Northern Virginia, the kind of man whose signature on a medical evaluation is considered ironclad. The correspondence was clinical at first. Then it turned into a series of transactions. Jennifer had promised a massive donation to the doctor's private research foundation once the Westcott estate was settled. The money was to come directly from the Heritage Preservation Fund, the same fund she had been siphoning. She was using Christopher's own genius to pay for the man who would sign his death warrant as a functioning adult. It was a three-way pact of greed and poison. I sat in the dark of the study, the report from the toxicology lab glowing on my phone. The slow burn was over. This was a slow-motion murder attempt for a paycheck. Jennifer thought she was playing a game of management. I realized then that she was playing for keeps. But she had forgotten one thing about my brother and me. We share the same face, yes. But I spent 25 years learning how to put people like her behind steel doors. The audit was finished. The evidence was irrefutable. Now, it was time for the execution of judgment. The air in the dining room was thick enough to choke on. Jennifer had arranged the silver and the crystal as if it were a tactical formation. This was her final play. She had invited her mother, Sarah, along with William and Olivia. She wanted an audience for the surrender. She sat there poised and surgical while I pushed the expensive salmon around my plate. She looked at the kids and sighed that practiced sound of a woman carrying a heavy burden. "We need to finalize the paperwork tonight," she said. "Christopher's fog is thickening. For the sake of the firm, for the sake of the family legacy, we need to sign the power of attorney." I looked at Sarah. She was 78 years old, small but iron-spined. She had been watching me all week, with a gaze that felt like a searchlight. I didn't flinch. Jennifer slid the legal documents across the mahogany table toward me. "Just sign here, darling," she said. Her voice was syrupy, but her eyes were already counting the money. Sarah stood up. Her chair didn't scrape. It moved with a quiet authority that silenced the room. "Christopher, walk with me to the balcony," she said. "I need a moment of air." Jennifer frowned, her management posture stiffening. "Mother, we are in the middle of a legal process." Sarah didn't even look at her. "He is my son-in-law, Jennifer. I am allowed a moment." We stepped out into the cool Georgetown night. Sarah leaned against the stone railing. "You aren't Christopher," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an audit. I didn't answer immediately. "My twin always takes his tea with lemon," she continued. "You take it black, and you look me in the eye when you speak. Christopher hasn't done that in 20 years. I turned to her, the retired investigator meeting the silent watcher. "I'm Michael," I said. Sarah let out a breath that sounded like 30 years of held air. She reached into her silk wrap and pulled out a stack of leather-bound journals. My husband ran my house the same way, she whispered. This was her silent regret, the heavy secret of a woman who had watched her daughter learn the architecture of control from a master. I watched Jennifer learn it. I thought she was protecting herself, learning how to be strong. I didn't understand she was learning how to build a cage until it was too late. I only started recording the details when I saw her reach for the vial. I realized then that she wasn't just controlling him, she was erasing him. And I was waiting for someone strong enough to help me stop her. She handed me the journals. This is 30 years of evidence, the sedatives, the isolation, the lies. Take it. We walked back into the dining room together. Jennifer was standing by my chair, the pen ready. Sign it now, she commanded. The mask was slipping. The greed was showing. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a manager. I saw an occupant of a space that was no longer hers. I'm not signing anything, Jennifer, I said. My voice was cold, lethal, and final. I pulled out my phone and played the recording from Tuesday night, her slurred, sedative-fueled confession about her right to his estate. William and Olivia went pale. Jennifer reached for the phone, but I caught her wrist. I'm Michael, I told her. Her face settled into a hollow terror. I realized her power wasn't hers. It was a rented position, built entirely on Christopher's brilliance and his money. She was the silent investor who had overdrawn her compassion, and I was there to inform her that her status was only a facade. The Westcott estate wasn't her kingdom, it was her crime scene. Jennifer was arrested for fraud and reckless endangerment later that night. I had filed an emergency protective order with the local precinct an hour earlier. When the officers arrived, they weren't just responding to a call, they were officially serving a legal mandate based on the evidence of medical abuse. The toxicology reports on the vial I swapped and the electronic trail of bribes to Dr. Hilliard were enough to open a criminal case that stripped away her high society mask. I stood on the edge of the driveway and watched the blue and red lights flicker against the stone of the Westcott estate. She looked small and hollow, without her spreadsheets and her iPad to hide behind. Watching her go, I was struck by the illusion of her authority. Jennifer's position in Georgetown was a rented status, a facade she maintained using Christopher's brilliance and his money. She believed that managing his firm made her the architect of his power, but power that isn't built on one's own character is just a lease on a hollow building. The moment a man with his own face looked her in the eye and stopped playing along, her world collapsed instantly. She had no internal foundation to stand on because she had spent 30 years cannibalizing her husband's identity. Christopher came back from Richmond 2 days later. He didn't move back into the big house. He couldn't stand the smell of the management and the medicine. Instead, he moved into the small stone cottage Sarah had held in her own name for him. It was a place with thick walls and a view of the river, where the only thing he had to restore was his own soul. William and Olivia spent their weekends there, helping their father go through old blueprints and new dreams. They were finally getting to know the man their mother had tried to drug out of existence. I sat with Sarah on the balcony of that cottage one last time before I drove back to Richmond. She looked older, but there was a quiet, steady light in her eyes. She told me that for decades, she had carried the heavy burden of a silent watcher. She had watched her own husband turn their home into a cage, and then she had watched her daughter do the same to mine. Her regret wasn't that she didn't love Jennifer. It was that she had been too afraid of the cage to help Christopher break it sooner. She finally found her peace by handing him the keys to his own life. I've come to realize that many people think control is a sign of a strong family. They think organization and micromanagement are the same as caring, but they aren't. Control is a sign of a small soul. It is the act of a heart so terrified of being left that it kills the thing it claims to love just to keep it still. If you find yourself in a similar situation, or if you're watching someone you love slowly fade in the shadow of a manager, remember this: real love is holding someone with an open hand. It's letting them go to a retreat, letting them take the promotion, and letting them be a different person than the one you planned for. Because the moment you put them in a box to keep them from leaving, you've already lost the person they were. Forgiveness isn't always for the person who built the cage. Sometimes it's the only way to step through the door and set yourself free. If this story reminded you that you are worth more than someone else's control, please share it. Subscribe to join a community that chooses authenticity over performance.